Imagine standing in the middle of the wilderness with Israel. Behind you is Egypt, the land they have just escaped. Ahead of you is a future they do not yet understand. Around you are thousands of tents spread across the desert. Families are cooking, children are playing, animals are moving through the camp. Moses has gone up the mountain, and then God gives instructions for something that must have seemed strangely specific. Build a tent. Not a palace, not a fortress, not a monument celebrating Israel's victory over Egypt. A tent. But this would not be an ordinary tent. Every measurement mattered. Every curtain mattered. Every piece of furniture mattered. There would be an outer courtyard, an altar, a basin, a holy place, a lampstand, a table, an altar of incense, a veil, and behind that veil, the most holy place. At the center would stand the Ark of the Covenant. Why so much detail? Why would the God who created heaven and earth ask a group of former slaves to build a portable sanctuary in the desert? And why does the New Testament repeatedly use the language of temples, priests, sacrifice, light, bread, cleansing, and God's presence when it talks about Jesus? Because the tabernacle is not just an ancient religious building. It is a map of the problem separating humanity from God, a map of the way God chooses to come near, and eventually, a map that helps explain what Jesus came to do. The key appears in one simple sentence in Exodus. God tells Moses to have the people make a sanctuary so that he may dwell among them. That is the purpose. Before the altar, before the lampstand, before the veil, before the priesthood. The central idea is presence. God wants to dwell among his people. That changes the way you read everything that follows. Because the Bible begins with another place where God and humanity are together. Eden. In the opening chapters of Genesis, humanity lives in a world where God's presence is not hidden behind curtains. There is no tabernacle, no priesthood, no altar standing between humanity and God. But rebellion changes the relationship. Humanity leaves the garden. Access is lost. And from that point forward, one of the great questions of the Bible becomes, how can a holy God dwell with people who are no longer holy? That is the question the tabernacle answers in miniature. Israel has been rescued from Egypt, but rescue from Pharaoh has not made them perfect. They complain, they doubt, they rebel. Even while Moses is receiving God's commands, the people create the golden calf. Think about the tension. God has rescued them because he wants them as his people. But the people God wants to live among are deeply flawed. How can his presence remain in their midst without simply ignoring what is wrong? The answer is the tabernacle. And this is where the building itself becomes part of the message. Imagine approaching it. You cannot simply walk straight into the most holy place. There is an order, an approach, a movement from outside toward the presence of God. First comes the outer courtyard. You enter through an opening in the surrounding curtains, and almost immediately you encounter the altar. That is significant. The first major object on the way toward God's presence is not a throne. It is not a library. It is not a place where someone displays all the good things they have done. It is an altar. In Israel's worship, sacrifice becomes part of the way broken people approach a holy God. Different offerings serve different purposes, and we should not pretend every sacrifice means exactly the same thing. But together they teach Israel that reconciliation is serious. Human wrongdoing is not meaningless. Sin damages relationships. It corrupts. It separates. Approaching God's presence is not casual, and yet the altar is also a sign of mercy. God has not told Israel to remain outside forever. He has provided a way to come near. That distinction matters. The tabernacle does not simply say, "You are unworthy, stay away." It says, "God is holy, but God has made a way for his people to approach." Then comes the basin. The priests wash before continuing their service. Again, the image is simple but powerful. Approach involves cleansing. The worshiper does not define impurity away. God provides a way for cleansing and restoration. Then you reach the tent itself. Inside the first chamber, the holy place, you find three important features: a lampstand, a table holding bread, and an altar of incense. Light, bread, prayer rising before God. Remember those images, because when Jesus appears in the Gospel of John, he begins using language that sounds strangely familiar. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. Do not rush past that. Centuries before Jesus speaks those words, Israel's sanctuary already contains light and bread in the place where priests minister before God. This does not mean every detail must be turned into a secret prediction. The Bible is not asking us to invent hidden codes inside every piece of furniture. But the New Testament repeatedly presents Jesus using images deeply rooted in Israel's scriptures. And once you understand the tabernacle, those images begin carrying more weight. The lampstand was not merely decoration. Its light burned inside the sanctuary. The bread was not merely food. It stood continually before God. These were parts of a sacred space built around the idea that God was dwelling among his people. Then Jesus says, I am the light. I am the bread. Something larger is happening. But there is still one place we have not entered. Beyond the holy place hangs a veil. Behind it is the most holy place. And here the entire structure reaches its center. The Ark of the Covenant stands there. The space represents God's unique presence among Israel. But access is restricted. Most Israelites will never walk inside. Ordinary priests do not simply enter whenever they choose. The high priest enters on the appointed Day of Atonement under carefully defined conditions. This creates one of the most important visual tensions in the entire Old Testament. God is near, and yet there is a veil. God dwells among his people, and yet access is limited. Presence and separation exist at the same time. Imagine being an Israelite standing outside the tabernacle. You can see the tent. You know God's presence is in the camp. You know he has chosen to dwell among his people. But you also know there are boundaries: courtyard, holy place, veil. Most holy place. Every layer tells the same story. God is near. But something still stands between. Then Exodus ends with one of the most powerful scenes in the Torah. The tabernacle is finally completed. Moses has followed the instructions. The structure is ready, and the glory of the Lord fills it. This is the moment the whole project has been moving toward. Not furniture, not architecture, presence. God, dwelling among his people. The wilderness camp now has a center. And notice what sits at that center. Not Moses' tent, not a military headquarters, not a throne for an Israelite king. The tabernacle. The message is clear. Israel's identity is supposed to be built around the presence of God. But the tabernacle does not remain forever. Israel eventually enters the land. Generations pass. The portable sanctuary gives way to the temple in Jerusalem. The building becomes larger, more permanent, more magnificent. But the basic idea continues: God dwelling among his covenant people. And the same problem continues as well. Buildings can be holy while human hearts remain far from God. Priests can perform rituals while people live unjustly. Sacrifices can continue while hearts remain unchanged. The prophets repeatedly confront Israel with this reality. God never wanted architecture without faithfulness. The sanctuary was never meant to become a religious machine where people could perform rituals and then live however they wanted. The structure pointed to relationship, God among his people belonging to him. Then something devastating happens. Jerusalem falls. The temple is destroyed. The people experience exile. The place that seemed to represent permanence disappears. And now the question becomes even larger. If the building is gone, has God's purpose failed? Will God ever dwell with his people again? The prophets keep hope alive. They speak of restoration, of cleansing, of a renewed people, of God's presence returning. Then centuries later, the Gospel of John begins with language that should sound familiar to anyone who remembers Exodus. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. John is announcing something extraordinary. The God who once revealed his presence in a tent has now come near in a person. Jesus does not merely visit a sanctuary. He becomes the place where God's presence is encountered. This becomes even clearer later in John. Jesus stands near the temple and speaks about raising the temple again. His listeners think he is talking about the enormous building in Jerusalem. John explains that Jesus is speaking about his body. That is one of the most important clues in the gospel. The center is moving, from building to person, from sacred architecture to Jesus himself. If you wanted to meet Israel's God in the Old Covenant story, the sanctuary stood at the center. Now John says, look at Jesus. This helps explain why Jesus can say and do things that seem shocking. He forgives, he cleanses, he welcomes. He speaks with authority. People considered socially or religiously unclean come near him, and instead of their uncleanness overcoming him, his wholeness begins restoring them. The direction has reversed. In many ancient religious systems, people are afraid that impurity will contaminate what is sacred. But around Jesus, holiness moves outward. He touches, he restores, he brings people near. That is exactly what the tabernacle story has been preparing us to understand. God wants to dwell among his people. The question has always been how. Now the answer is standing among them, Jesus. And look again at the tabernacle. The altar said, reconciliation matters. Jesus gives himself for others. The basin pointed toward cleansing. Jesus speaks about making people clean. The lampstand brought light into the holy place. Jesus says he is the light of the world. The bread stood in God's presence. Jesus says he is the bread of life. The priesthood represented mediation between God and the people. The New Testament presents Jesus as the great high priest. The veil represented restricted access. And when the gospel story reaches the cross, something remarkable happens. The temple curtain is torn from top to bottom. That detail matters. The barrier associated with restricted access is opened. The gospel does not present this as a random architectural accident. Placed at the moment of Jesus' sacrifice, it becomes a powerful image. Something has changed about access to God. This is where Hebrews becomes essential. If you want to understand how early Christians interpreted Jesus through the tabernacle, read Hebrews slowly. Hebrews speaks about priests, sanctuary, sacrifice, covenant, the most holy place. And then it presents Jesus as the high priest who accomplishes what the older system could only anticipate. The old priests served repeatedly. Jesus' work is presented as decisive. The old sanctuary was earthly. Hebrews points beyond it. The old system placed boundaries around access. Hebrews speaks about confidence, to draw near to God. In other words, Jesus does not simply add one more religious ritual to the old system. He fulfills what the system was teaching. Think again about the journey through the tabernacle. You began outside. Then came the altar. Then cleansing. Then the holy place. Then the veil. Then the most holy place. The entire structure asked, how can someone outside come near? Hebrews says Jesus has opened the way. This is why Christianity is not fundamentally about traveling to one sacred building on earth so that you can be close to God. The center is no longer one tent in the wilderness. It is not one temple in Jerusalem. The New Testament makes an even more surprising claim. God now dwells among and within his people through his Spirit. Paul can describe believers themselves as God's temple. Think about how radical that would sound after following the biblical story. In Exodus, God's presence fills the tabernacle. Later, God's glory is associated with the temple. Then Jesus speaks of his own body as the temple. Then the church is described as a temple. The movement keeps expanding. Tent, temple, Jesus, his people. But the story still is not finished. Because the final destination of the Bible is not simply individual spiritual experience. It is revelation, and in the closing chapters of Revelation, John sees a renewed creation. Then he hears an announcement that sounds like the final answer to Exodus. God's dwelling is with humanity. Look at how far the story has traveled. In Eden, humanity loses unhindered fellowship. In the wilderness, God dwells in the middle of Israel's camp, but curtains and boundaries remain. In the temple, his presence is associated with a permanent sanctuary, but Israel still struggles with sin and rebellion. In Jesus, God comes near in human form. Through Jesus, access is opened. Through the Spirit, God's people become a dwelling place. And Revelation ends with God dwelling with humanity fully. The tabernacle was always moving toward something larger. Not simply a better tent, not simply a larger temple. A restored world where separation no longer defines the relationship between God and his people. Now go back to the title. If you understand the tabernacle, you understand what Jesus came to do. What did Jesus come to do? He came to bring God near. That sounds simple until you understand the problem. Human beings want God's blessings without always wanting God's holiness. We want comfort without transformation, presence without surrender, forgiveness without change. But the tabernacle never allows that separation. Every part of it says, God's presence is good, and God's presence is holy. The goal is not simply getting something from God. The goal is God himself dwelling with his people. Jesus comes to restore that relationship. He does not merely come to make people more religious. Israel already had religious rituals. He does not simply come to give humanity more information about morality. Israel already had commandments. He comes to do something the old system pointed toward, but could never complete on its own. To bring people near, to cleanse, to reconcile, to open access, to form a people in whom God dwells. And this may change the way you think about salvation. Sometimes salvation is reduced to one question: how do I avoid punishment? But the tabernacle asks a deeper question: how can I live in the presence of God? Those are related, but they are not identical. The goal of the biblical story is not simply escaping something bad. It is being restored to the Red Seas. Passover rescued Israel from Egypt. But Exodus did not end at the Red Sea. God brought Israel out so that he could bring them near. That is why Mount Sinai comes after Egypt. That is why covenant comes after deliverance. That is why the tabernacle stands in the center of the camp. Freedom from Pharaoh was not the final goal. Life with God was. The same pattern appears in Jesus. Forgiveness is not the end of the story. It opens the way to relationship. Grace does not simply erase the past. It creates a new future. And if God's desire is to dwell with his people, then the Christian life cannot be reduced to attending religious events while keeping God at the edge of everything else. The tabernacle stood in the middle of Israel, not outside the camp as an optional attraction, at the center. What would change if God's presence became the center of your life, instead of something you visited when you needed help? Your decisions would change. Your relationships would change. The way you treat people would change. The way you use your time would change. The things you hide would become harder to protect. Because presence transforms. And that is another lesson the tabernacle teaches. The closer you move toward the center, the more seriously holiness is treated. Modern people sometimes hear the word holiness and imagine cold religious perfection. But biblically, holiness is connected to belonging to God, to being set apart for him. The tabernacle says, God wants to be near you, but he also loves you too much to pretend the things destroying you do not matter. Jesus shows the same combination, grace and truth. welcome and transformation, mercy and holiness. He sits with sinners, but he does not celebrate what keeps them in bondage. He receives people as they are, and then calls them to follow. That is tabernacle theology in motion. God coming near without becoming indifferent to sin. And perhaps this is why the image of the veil matters so much. A veil says, there is something on the other side, something real, something near. But access is not yet open. Imagine generations of Israelites knowing the most holy place exists but never entering it. Then imagine hearing that the curtain has been opened. Hebrews takes that image and tells believers to draw near. Do you see the reversal? The old question was, who is allowed in? The new invitation is, come near, not casually, not arrogantly, but confidently, because the way has been opened. The gospel is not God telling humanity to climb high enough to reach him. The pattern of the tabernacle is the opposite. God comes down. God gives the pattern. God dwells among the people. And eventually, in Jesus, God comes nearer still. This is why Christmas and the tabernacle belong in the same story. The child in Bethlehem is not merely a teacher waiting to grow up. John says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The presence once associated with the sanctuary is now walking through villages, eating with people, touching the forgotten, teaching crowds, welcoming children, standing beside grieving families, calling disciples, God with us. And the story moves from God's presence in Jesus to God's presence among his people. Then it ends with God's presence filling everything. No veil, no restricted chamber, no distant sanctuary people can only approach through layers of separation. Revelation even makes the astonishing statement that in the final city, John sees no temple building in the way he expects, because God and the Lamb are its temple. The symbol has reached its goal. You no longer need a structure representing God's presence, when God's presence fills the reality itself. Now go back one final time to the wilderness. See Israel's tents stretching across the desert. See families gathered. See Moses. See the tabernacle standing in the middle of the camp. See the altar, the basin, the lampstand, the bread, the incense, the veil, the ark. Then watch the cloud cover the tent. The glory fills it. And remember the sentence that explains everything. God wants to dwell among his people. Then move forward. See Solomon's temple. See the prophets longing for restoration. See Bethlehem. See Jesus walking among ordinary people. Hear him call himself the light. Hear him call himself the bread. Hear him speak about his body as the temple. See the curtain opened. Listen to Hebrews speak of a way into God's presence. See communities of believers described as God's dwelling place. Then turn to the final pages of Revelation, and hear the announcement, God's dwelling is with humanity. That is the thread, from Eden, to the wilderness, to the tabernacle, to the temple, to Jesus, to his people, to Revelation. The story has always been about presence, God coming near, God making a way, God restoring what was lost. So if you understand the tabernacle, you begin to understand what Jesus came to do. He came to become the meeting place between God and humanity. He came to open what had been closed, to bring near those who were far away, to cleanse what had been corrupted, to restore relationship, to make a people into a dwelling place for God, and ultimately, to move the story toward the day when no veil remains. Maybe that is the part of the gospel we forget most easily. God does not merely want to improve your circumstances. He wants you. The entire biblical story keeps moving toward communion, presence, God with his people, and his people with him. The tabernacle was never merely a tent. It was a promise in architectural form. A promise that the distance between God and humanity would not last forever. A promise that God himself would make a way to come near. And according to the New Testament, that promise takes on a face, Jesus. So the next time you read Exodus, and reach all those measurements: curtains, rings, poles, tables, lamps, priests, and instructions. Do not rush through them. Slow down. You are not reading meaningless construction details. You are watching a picture being built. A picture of holiness. A picture of access. A picture of cleansing. A picture of sacrifice. A picture of light. A picture of bread. A picture of priesthood. A picture of God's presence. And once you see that picture, the New Testament begins to look different. John 1 looks different. John 2 looks different. The cross looks different. Hebrews looks different. Revelation looks different. Because the thread was there all along. A tent in the wilderness. A God who wanted to live among his people. And a story that would not end until humanity could finally hear, God's dwelling is with them. If this changed the way you see the tabernacle, go back and read Exodus 25 through 40 slowly. Do not treat the details as filler. Ask what each part teaches about approaching God. Then read the Gospel of John, and notice how often Jesus uses language that echoes the sanctuary: dwelling, light, bread, temple, glory. Then read Hebrews 9 and 10. And finally, read Revelation 21. Follow the movement, from distance to presence, from restriction to access, from symbol to fulfillment, from tabernacle to Jesus. Because sometimes the most complicated-looking passages in the Bible are hiding one remarkably simple message. God wants to dwell with his people. And once you understand that, you begin to understand what Jesus came to do. God bless you.